Hey guys, welcome to the Lunge and Nid podcast. Today we have a topic which is very close to my heart, 3D or triplanar training. We're going to talk all about what it actually is, why I'm so obsessed about it, and how you should build it into your training to get all the benefits, which we'll go into a lot of detail about because there are a lot of benefits and everyone should definitely be doing it. But before we get into it, we are announcing the winner of our giveaway, and it is Miss or Mrs. I'm going to say Ms. Sally Beck. So we'll be in touch over Instagram to give you your prizes. Congratulations and thank you
Well
to
done.
everybody who took part. We appreciate you sharing the love and getting our name out there. As always, a thank you to our show sponsors, Wit Fitness. Check them out at wit-fitness.com and use discount code LL15 for 15% off your purchase. And Hydro, our blood flow restriction partner, please check them out and use discount code LL20 to get 20% off your purchase. All right, let's get into it. Let's start with what is 3D training, or what are the three planes of motion? Rob, what do you think?
Right, so sagittal, frontal, and transverse.
Exactly. So sagittal plane is forward, back, or up and down. Frontal plane is left to right. It's confusing because it has the word front in it, but it splits the front and back. So it's going left and right. And the transverse plane is rotating left and right. And it's the three dimensions that allow us to model movement in space, because obviously things can, if you drew a graph, you've got your X, Y, and Z axis. So you need those three to actually position something in three-dimensional space. So we can then model movement and we can critically assess movement to see how individual parts of the body, move.
Yeah, I definitely think as a since starting your mentorship and kind of diving deeper into some of these these movements and stuff like that. It's funny because I've always known sagittal, frontal, and transverse. Like I get it, rotate like front and back, and as you say, like going left and right. And it's when you realize how much the ankle does that independently, the knee does this independently, the hip, like beyond just your whole body moving left and right, forward and back and rotating, there is such an intricate detail to this. And it's, even though we've just had our third coaching session, and we're just talking about the ankles, it's amazing the depth. But when we start getting into it, you start to really understand a lot more, and kind of then, because you understand why, say, a dysfunction of ankle/foot travels up the body and then causes something else to happen. And yeah, it's really good. But something I'd love to know is, why are you? I guess you're Mr. 3D, right? You are. I remember all your stuff, going all the directions. Why are you so obsessed with triplanar work?
I think for me, it was a real penny drop moment. I think a lot of stuff just seemed to click, and it made so much sense of movement in, like you say, like in a deeper way than the traditional ways of
Yeah.
evaluating movement. Like when you're taught on level 3 PT to look at somebody's squat or deadlift, the coaching angle is from the side because all you care about is the sagittal. So you just see how things stack up in that plane. You would never stand behind them or even have a view from the top down, which is how you would assess the transverse plane. And I think, as you alluded to there, all bones, joints, and muscles are operating in three planes of motion, whether we like it or not. So even if we are doing a sagittal movement, there are still frontal and transverse components. And once you start to appreciate that, so many unexplained things start to make sense. Like you start to understand why the most popular bodybuilding exercises are the most popular bodybuilding exercises, because they make use of the three-dimensional loading of certain muscles, so you feel them better, you get a better pump in them, rather than muscles that aren't quite tapping into the exact planes of motion that a muscle likes. You can also understand why certain people struggle to activate certain muscles and certain movements, because they're blocking the plane of motion at the joint that muscle requires to activate. You also can see why certain joints get overused, because a compensation pattern might occur in a certain plane. And all these things just start to fall into place once you're looking for those different planes of motion within a big overall movement. So I think, yeah, there's so many examples, like why some people are very strong in certain movements, but then in a very similar movement. Like, so why do some people have good squat depth when they're in wide stance, but not in narrow stance? Those sorts of things all start to fall into place when you appreciate, all those three planes of motion.
Yeah, I think what's interesting you mentioned there about like back in the level 3 and like the spot like the looking at your client moving, and you're kind of always at like a diagonal for them, so you can kind of, you're getting a little bit of frontal, a little bit of sagittal, but you're kind of looking at that position. But I always remember it was, you want to try and always move around the person, so like 360, getting close, getting back. And it's funny you say you need to go kind of on top of them to kind of look down. It might be a bit weird in a session, and people are like, what are you
Get a step
doing?
ladder out.
But yeah, but it's really interesting because you say this and it's like a squat can look perfect, and then essentially you go from behind, you see their hip shifting. And I think only because I've seen this myself, and it's like in my own squat, it's like I hit good depth, it looks relatively good. And if you're looking at it, especially from like an Instagram angle, where not the female Instagram angle, the booty angle, I'm talking about like the one where you kind of see the weight, see your body, and looking at an overall movement pattern.
Yeah.
You don't see those hip shifts that much because of the angle. But then as soon as you get behind and you do the booty angle, you're like, whoa. And I was just like, because I was like, fuck me, I didn't realize how much. And when you then put that into, say, body weight, and it probably doesn't come up body weight, it starts to come under load when the body has to then, find ways of moving that load. And you're starting to get pretty heavy. It makes sense then why injuries come and injuries occur, because you're moving, say, in a frontal position, so going to the side, and then now you've got all this extra load going through somewhere where it's not comfortable being in. So I guess this is what you do, is taking that 360 view into the next level, isn't it? Because that's where you then see that movement, say that lateral hip shift, and you say, okay, cool, why has that happened? And look through all the three planes and say, okay, cool, what is happening at each, say the ankle, knee, hip, upper back, like what is all going on in this movement pattern to cause the dysfunction? So
Exactly.
where would you go from that? Like what would be your first point of call if you saw me squatting and you saw me shifting into my hip, and say into my right hip? What would be one of your first points of call to do?
Cool. So I think whenever you're performing an assessment, we've got to compare what we want to see with what we're actually seeing. So ideally, in the perfect squat, which doesn't exist, there's zero asymmetry. It's perfectly balanced left and right. And if it's not doing that, then how is it not doing that? What's the quality of movement that is straying away from perfect? So if your hips are shifting right, so sideways movement would be in the frontal plane. So one hip would be adducting more and the other one would be abducting more than is perfect. So that starts to give us some clues as to what might be going on. We can reverse engineer or figure out which muscles might be causing either of those joint motions because of our knowledge of anatomy and the planes of motion that muscles like to operate in. If it's frontal, we've got some usual suspects or likely candidates for the muscles that would be involved. Whereas if it was a transverse plane deviation from perfect, then other muscles are likely to be involved just because of where they attach on the body. They can only pull in certain directions. They can only pull in certain planes. And that is the beginning of the investigation to say, right, it's a frontal compensation or it's a transverse compensation. What's the next step? Like which like it is like a murder investigation. Like if it happened in a certain place, only certain people could have done it because they, if you're in France at the time, it couldn't have been you. And so if it's if it's a rotation compensation, it isn't going to be the muscles that are necessarily just working in the frontal plane.
And So this just got me thinking as well. Like, so what when I've seen before with squats, and then coming into like, and you see people coming out the hole, and you're going into a form of rotation as well. So you're starting to open up the hip. So I guess, say, using my squat as an example, say if say shifting into my right hip, and then you see me starting to open with that left shoulder, that's, I guess, obviously going to break it down and give you more clues into, say, why this dysfunction is happening. So it's great. We've now got you've got the understanding, and say if you're someone that's just recording their lifts, obviously it's important to try and get multiple angles, especially on your later sets, because as I said there, sometimes you don't see it. Like when I under say 140 kilos from me on a squat, I could probably keep a solid position ish. You might get some fluctuation, but as soon as I go above that, my body's going to start to favor it's my right quad, my right side, and start to push more into that. So if you are looking to assess yourself essentially and trying to look for some of these different planes of motion that you're probably going into, make sure you're getting multiple angles with different sets and kind of building this third eye essentially, so the coach's eye. Now, once you've got that, what's the next step from there? Like, what could someone do once they've now identified some of this? We're obviously talking about like triplanar training as a whole. So how do we? So we've identified it. What kind of movements, or can we start to think, okay, how can we now train this movement pattern into a correct movement pattern?
Yeah, good question. So I think once we can get clear on the movement quality that we're either missing or we have too much of, that's how we can start to build the process of addressing it. So say we've got too much adduction on one side, too much abduction on the other side. That tells us the movement qualities that we need to work on. So we need to say one hip is going towards the outside, the other hip's going towards the inside. If we're shifting one towards one side, same side too many times. The simplest way to think about it is we need to restore the ability to go the other way. So if the hips are shifting right, we need to move the hips left at the simplest level. That's the beginning of a corrective program. We can drill down deeper into other movement qualities like mobility and stability, which might be affecting why the hips are shifting right or left and the specific muscles that are involved in that. But at its simplest, because we have a greater level of detail in seeing movement, we can have a greater level of detail in prescribing movements that will address it. Whereas I think the standard level of addressing an imbalance would be, oh, the right leg's stronger, just train the left leg more. But how are you training the left leg more? What way are you training the left leg more? And I think layering on the 3 planes of motion just gives us such a more targeted approach. So the efficacy of our intervention is going to be much, much greater.
Yeah, no, I think that's massive, because I know over the years where my knowledge has been less than now and still learning massively. And that thing of course, okay, the left leg is weaker, say, because I feel I'm pushing all through my right as the example. So, okay, do more work on that left side. But I think as you identified there is just doing more will not equal better, because just because then I'm strengthening my left leg, it's not my left leg is necessarily weaker per se, it's just not being kept in the position to work at its full potential. So this is then where you obviously have to understand. So if using this squat as an example, my hips are shifting to the right and I'm using my right leg to stand up more than my left, doesn't mean I got a weak left leg. It just means I'm only using, say, 60% of the effort compared to my right side, where I might be using, say, 100% of the effort compared to the other way. Yeah. Now, I guess when that comes into it, so what would be, how would you understand, like, just not to do the left leg more? What would be the clue to say, okay, cool, if I'm shifting to that right? Because I know an example of say keeping with the squat, if I pull my hips to the left, it's going to feel really weird. It's going to feel like I'm massively to the left, but I'm probably actually more neutral. And that's the thing, because we have such comfort in where the body's going to. This is why, again, filming yourself, if you don't have a coach there to kind of review your movement pattern, and you say, right, on this set, not at your top weight, but say, body weight going up a little bit, so you've got a little bit challenging load, you think, right, I'm going to really load into that left side and make it feel like I'm exaggerating it, and then see what that looks like in the video. That's what I would do. Now, as a I guess is that what you would suggest? And
Yeah.
then okay, cool, Karen.
So I think yeah, you make a really good point there. That what is it that we're seeing that means well, we've got that shift to the right. So the hips are moving in the frontal plane to the right. That to you will feel normal because it's the most efficient way your body currently knows to stand up the squat. So no one with an imbalance or an asymmetry does that on purpose. They're just doing what their body to date thinks is best given its current resources. So when you do move towards neutral, it will feel left of where you want to be. And given your current movement mechanics, will feel odd. So the game is, how do we give your body the experience and the training stimulus that teaches it what is a better normal? So going too far to the left, it will feel like your hips are way left when you're actually in neutral, will reset what your body perceives to be its center. So because we've been quite detailed in how we've identified the imbalance as it's a frontal plane shift to the right, we can have a frontal plane shift to the left to teach that left hip what it's like to be have the hip outside the knee rather than towards the inside. And then once it's experienced that, it will realize, oh, actually, I feel more balanced here. And as that left leg starts to catch up and realize that this is better, it will be happier being more towards actual middle rather than its perception of middle.
Yeah, I think what's really key here as well, and from my own personal experience with kind of this asymmetry, is I know when I'm squatting the heaviest, I feel my right leg stand up the weight. I actively feel my right leg do more, and pretty much my left leg feels like it's switched off. So it's crazy, that difference. Yet obviously both legs are working, otherwise I wouldn't be standing up. But it just shows that my muscle connection is a lot weaker, and it's just not necessarily there. Now, with certain movement, so which we're kind of going to go into in a little bit, but when we start to maybe pick some movement patterns that are going to now dominate that left hip and make it work in the position that it needs to get stronger in, we then also need to be still doing the movement itself, so like say squatting, and then trying to, so we have our accessory piece, which is the specific movement, but then we also have our main movement that we're trying to improve, and then focusing on, say, that left drive. Something that I've used myself over the time is when I am in warm-ups, especially because that's where I'm trying to tell my body what to do later on in the set. Now, I'm thinking about, right, when I'm at the bottom of the squat, I push into my left foot. So I'm driving into that left leg, and I'm trying to keep the weight in my left side. So I'm not actually thinking left hip shift. I'm actually just thinking left leg press, because what that's hopefully going to do is keep my hips more neutral, because they shouldn't then jump to the right, because I'm actually using both sides. So let's now break that down. As in, like, let's now go into some movement specific stuff. What would be something that you would say prescribe as an example for using this hip shift as an example?
Yeah, so I think if we've identified the missing movement quality as left hip adduction, we need to find a movement that creates the missing left hip adduction. So that you can think of that as scaling back your heavy back squat towards something like a split squat or maybe a lunge, something that achieves that training stimulus. And then, as you're saying there, the key, like the secret sauce to making it integrate well with your normal training is bridging the gap between that quite that quite unusual movement mechanics exercise that definitely gets left hip adduction, and then bridging the gap towards a heavy back squat. So this is the thing we talk about all the time called the spectrum of specificity. Like where are we now? At the moment, we can't get left hip adduction. So we need to do something that might be very different to back squatting to get left hip adduction. Once we're getting left hip adduction for sure, we then fill in the gaps, make some stepping stones to keep left hip adduction all the way through to heavy back squats where the left hip adduction actually happens. And for everyone, that can be, for anyone who has that same movement mechanic pattern, it could be slightly different, but generally it will be some form of like lunging, split squats, or squats, making sure that we maintain the training stimulus of left hip adduction all the way through. And like you said earlier, we'll get to a certain weight where the compensation will probably come back. At that point, we've lost the training stimulus. We're no longer training left hip adduction. So that's fine if you're competing or just looking to hit a heavy set. But if we're trying to improve the movement quality, that's our signal to say we need to work a little bit lower than that to keep drilling the missing mechanic of left
Yeah.
hip adduction.
And building up that foundation, that's the thing, because there's the difference between obviously training and competing, which we talk about a lot, and like testing. When you are going to heavy weights, you do have to ask yourself, cool, okay, if I am prepping for something and I need to hit certain numbers before a certain date, fair enough. But if you're in your off season or you're just training to get stronger in life and just better, then we are going to say, make sure you're reviewing footage, looking at yourself, cool, this is happening at this weight. Say, for instance, when I said 140. So maybe working at 130 and really get that left hip, left leg really working. Then maybe the following week, 135 or 132, or maybe some more reps. And the thing is, when you do keep yourself balanced, it's actually harder to train, because then you're working something that doesn't normally work that hard, because it's always shifting, say, into the right. So my left leg is going to be working. So you might get left glute DOMs, and like you might get more because you're actually staying here. So for instance, with myself, I often do pretty much singles or doubles up towards my working set. So I go, say, 60, 100, 120, 140, 160, then I'm normally somewhere there or above. So I've maybe done 8 reps and I'm at like 160. Do you know? And this is the thing, this is how okay, maybe I might do, say, 6 with the empty bar and then maybe 5 with 60. But generally, I just like to get to that top set, because I'm just like, cool, I'm there. I'm getting myself under the stress. And this is then where I miss the training stimulus of getting my left hip to work, because I haven't given myself enough time and stress and opportunity to review. So that's where so I do like to try and program accessories that I know kind of work on some of these imbalances, because for me, the squat is the squat. I crack on, I get to the top and I do my work. And I'm not squatting to improve my squat mechanics necessarily. I'm squatting to lift a heavier load. Take that back to then when I do my secondary squat days, when it's not as heavy, then I am focusing more on those. But when I am on a performance day, I'm getting to my numbers, and that's what I'm focusing on rather than the movement specific mechanics.
Exactly. And we're going to come to how to build your triplanar training in just a little bit later. But before we do, I want to hammer my sales pitch for triplanar training a little bit harder.
Of course.
I think a few points I want to make here are that we have a principle in training that gets taught, hopefully in most courses, called the SAID principle, specific adaptation to imposed demand. So whatever you train your body for, it will adapt towards. And one of the drawbacks of most traditional training, which is very sagittal focused, is that the imposed demand is just training our body and our joints and our muscles in one plane of motion. So we're specifically adapting to sagittal. What that means is when we're eventually exposed to more frontal and transverse motion, we are not prepared for it as well as if we had exposed our body to those directions in training. And that sounds quite obvious, but it's, I think, massively underappreciated. And this sort of explains why you see some people who are very fit and very strong. They go for a little kick around and they pull a hamstring, tear a calf, all this sort of stuff, because they've conditioned their bodies to be so sagittal dominant that the smallest amount of change of direction, frontal plane and transverse motion, is a huge system shock, both to the nervous system, because it doesn't know how to control those positions and motions, but also from a tissue tolerance point of view, you haven't exposed the relevant ligaments and tendons that are used to keep those positions safe to any training stress. So they actually haven't built up the capacity to handle the forces. Whereas if you had been moving in those ways throughout all your training, and they would be getting progressively overloaded, like your sagittal structures. And one of the things that illustrates this really nicely for me is the difference between my gym friends and my non-gym friends who are
Yeah.
also, they're very sporty, but they just aren't that bothered about the gym, and they're, yeah, playing football, playing squash, whatever their chosen sports are, but they can do those things load like 5 times a week. Some of them, might play football 3 times a week, might play squash 5 times a week, and they're fine because they're constantly exposing themselves to all these changes of direction. Put them under a heavy back squat, they'll get crushed. But in terms of the demands of their sport, because they have been exposing themselves to all three planes of motion, their tissues have built up an incredible tolerance. So even though they're not necessarily gym fit or gym strong, they are specifically strong for their sport. And I think for most people, unless you're competing in a barbell sport, having general physical preparedness should involve more triplanar training,
Yeah.
because life is triplanar. Like, you're not often picking up heavy stuff in a perfect bilateral stance with perfect symmetrical loading. You're going to be picking up your kid, grandkids,
To the side,
nephew, niece
yeah.
from the side, pulling them over. So we,
And
if we,
playing. That could
exactly,
play
yeah,
is triplanar. Play
totally,
is like everything. Sorry to obviously interrupt, but it's just I've taken on this new client, and he's come to me with back pain, so we're working with that. And so he come when he started with me, he was like, right, I'm seeing this physio, and should I work with you or the physio? And I said, right, physios are great. They're kind of going to get you back to baseline. I'm going to take you beyond baseline. So, and I can kind of get you back to baseline as well. So it's up to you. Chose me. And he chucked in his physio, and he said to the physio, cool, okay, this was happening. And the physio said, all right, just make sure your PT is probably going to disagree with this. So this is probably, and I didn't, when I took a second thought about this, I actually thought, I get that, because there are a lot of one track minded PTs out there. And then the physio goes, right, so tell your PT you must use your back. And I was like, of course you do. Like, you're not gonna hide away from your back. He needs to get a stronger back. But it just made me think of these things. When I was explaining to him, I was like, the thing is, you're trying to pick up your grandkid. And he's like, you're going to pick him up, and he's to the side of you, and he wants to play golf again. I'm like, everything is coming in that type of rotation motion. It's like, we need to get you stronger in the back. We're not going to hide away from that. And it's amazing, because like I think the GPP side of stuff kind of gets glamorized to some degree, because with CrossFit being getting you essentially ready for everything, but it kind of doesn't at the same time,
yeah,
because it is so sagittal, maybe frontal, very rarely transverse. And when I say maybe frontal, I mean,
box
that's
jump overs, and that's it.
or then you go to the games, you're doing like the 40-yard dashes type thing, and you got some round the cones and stuff. But
Yeah.
do you know what I mean? It's like that type of movement is like, it's called GPP, but then actually you're still not really. And I think that getting you ready for life is just, you have to find that sweet balance, don't you, between your gym friends and your non-gym friends, and finding that exposure, which is, I guess, obviously what a lot of your training is around. And because you try and keep both sides of it. So you do some sport and you do some gym training that's kind of improves your sport.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's perfectly articulated there. And yeah, just to move on to like the other reasons why I think triplanar training is worth time and attention is that even if all you care about is growing muscles, like from a bodybuilding point of view, as I said earlier, certain muscles will only work well, or you can only target those muscles if you tap into the planes of motion that they like. And this is a classic example of this, is why you'll get more pec stimulation from flies than you will from narrow grip bench, for example. They're both sort of chesty exercise. Obviously, narrow grip bench is a bit more tricepy shoulders. But why is that? It's because of where the muscles attach on the bones, and we're tapping into the plane of motion that lengthens pec major better.
Yeah.
And bodybuilders sort of have an innate understanding of the mechanics of the body, because you can feel the muscle
Yeah.
more when you understand how to target it. And I actually had a guy when I was doing one of the gym box workshops who was a bodybuilder, and we were going through this sort of stuff, and he was like, I've never been able to get my rear delt, and I've never trained anybody to grow a rear delt, but he was like a high level bodybuilder, and he had identified that that's something that was missing in his physique. And so all I did was look at an anatomy chart and say, like, look, this is the muscle you're trying to grow. Okay, so we know it originates here and it inserts there. So all we need to do is take those away from each other and bring them together. And it's like, we could do that on the cable machine like this. And it's like, no, I've tried something like that. And it's like, have you tried it like this? Like, turn your hand in a bit more transverse plane. And he's like, his eyes just lit up. It's like, oh shit, that's it.
That
I've
was
never
the
been
key.
able to feel that muscle
Yeah.
activate. So even though that's very non-functional, it still lets us
Specific,
train
isn't
more
it? It's
effectively.
specific to him.
Yeah, exactly. He's getting the training stimulus that he wants, and it just means that you don't need to have an exercise library in your head. You can work it out because we understand the three planes of motion and where muscles are on the body. It means we can solve any problem because that's a fundamental way of tapping into how muscles like to be challenged.
Do you know though? It's like even though we say this, it's funny how sometimes little tweaks, like how you hold something, makes the biggest difference. And even like the kit that you use, sometimes you need a band because you need that constant resistance. You need a cable, you need a dumbbell, like you need a barbell, whatever it is. And I think because it's so easy to get stuck in the groove of this is what a bench press should look like, that you can't grab wider or you can't grab offset, you can't grab reverse grip, you can't do all these, you can't grab neutral, there's all these different positions. I mean, neutral on a flat barbell might be a bit hard, but you get a specialty bar. Yeah. And, but yeah, this is something that I've kind of really learned, say, especially from like the time when I started, say, working at WIT, kind of got to know you and stuff like that, and that did make me think more outside of the other ranges of motion, and just doing CrossFit in general kind of did, because it opened my eyes to other movements. And when you start to realize that there isn't one specific way, unless you're competing in whatever, like even the, say, powerlifting, right? There's no set width stance for a deadlift. There's no set width stance for a squat. The bar has to be on your back. I don't know if there's a limit of how low, but technically, I don't think there is. I might be wrong there. I've never checked.
Yeah.
But low bar, high bar, all in betweens. The idea is it starts at point A, finishes at point B, and goes back to point A. Same as clean and jerk, same as a snatch. All these movements, they have things, but everyone does it their own way. But we look at, say, the strongest and say, right, this is how it needs to look. But it's not then tailored towards our body, our weaknesses, our imbalances, and our strengths. And this is the thing is, I think when you start to think a little bit more, take that extra step deeper into training and think, okay, am I feeling this in my chest with the bench press? No. Then cool. Do I need the barbell bench press? If you're not competing in powerlifting, no, you can get a great. We touched on this on a previous episode. Using dumbbells, using cables, using whatever, flies, pullovers.
Yeah.
There are so many different movements that you can do that are going to target your chest if your goal is to, say, stimulate the chest.
Yeah, that's a really good example. I think that's a common thing that people experience, in that they're trying to target a muscle group and they're using a standard exercise that, like in air quotes, should target that muscle group, but they're not feeling it. They're not able to get that stimulus. And sure, you can just try another standard exercise that's supposed to target that muscle group, or because you have an understanding of triplanar muscle loading mechanics, you can adjust the movement so that, like you said, those subtle tweaks can be the difference between getting that muscle to fire and not. That subtle turn of the hands outwards means that muscle now comes online because you're speaking to it in the language that it likes. And that is why, obvious stuff like if you're doing a bent over row and you want to get more biceps, the supinated grip works better. Some people also feel more lats when they do that grip as well. And that is because of the triplanar situation for those muscles, like where they attach on the bones. We're getting more lengthening and shortening from that setup. And I think for athletes and coaches, having an appreciation of what stimulus you're trying to achieve, and then that will steer your tweaks in the right direction, rather than just thinking, oh, that exercise doesn't work for me. You can probably adjust that exercise to make it work for you with a good understanding of it.
Do you know, it just made me think, because I know I've done this in the past as well, but especially with back training in general, and you say about bent over rows, supinated grip, so that's where your palms are facing the ceiling, and you're putting in and say, cool, okay, biceps, but you also feel more lats. A lot of that time is just because even if you right now put your arm out in front of you and rotate your arm around the other way, you naturally feel under your armpits move. So even if your lat isn't engaging more, you think you'll get engaging more because you have a better mind muscle connection. And this is the thing, it's like using, say, the bench press as the example, because I just want to stick with that. You might have to start with a neutral grip or underhand grip with dumbbells or something like that. And then you can work your way towards a standard bench press when you have a better connection with the movement. Because your chest just might not be able to feel that movement because it can't activate it yet. As you said, it's not speaking the same language. So you have to be going, right, maybe neutral, a little bit tighter so your lats are a little bit more engaged, you bigger range of motion potentially, and then you can start to feel it. Then the elbows can get a little bit further away from the body. And then you can have a fixed object. It's like, it's not being afraid to explore movement. And I think this is where I feel training is starting to become more about exploring. I do think more people are kind of going outside of the norm. Then there's obviously extremes, but I think this is where things like, knees over toes and stuff like that comes in, because what these people are doing is they're taking people to, say, end ranges that they're not necessarily used to, and they because they think it's bad, and they're just doing things that you are against their narrative. And then that might then open up the doors for them to try other things. Like, say they might try knees over toes, and then they're going to try more pronation in their shoulders when they're pressing. They might be trying, like, I don't know, just some other things, because they thought, do you know what, if I can do this with my knee, I can do this with something else. And it starts to open that rabbit hole. And I think this is the whole thing with Triplanar Training. Once you kind of open up your eyes to it and think, do you know what? Let me just give it a try. It starts to make you think, okay. I said this to Ash at the start of the podcast, is I wish I had more to counter Ash with, to make this maybe a bit more engaging at times and stuff like that. But the problem is a lot of this stuff just makes sense, especially once you've tried it. And you start moving in these things, you start to feel things. And this is why when we go into now, like, how do you build 3D training into your training? Don't necessarily take it all, but we'll note it down. Try one thing and start to just add to it. So let's now, rather than just teasing, should we go into how can people start adding this into their own training? And
yeah, sure. I think the easiest way, and probably the thing I'd recommend for most people to start doing straight away, is just adding it into your warm-up as some form of movement prep. So this is where we're tapping into those three planes of motion, hopefully in a relevant way to the movement we're about to train. So say you're about to do deadlifts. This is like, I've started to try and make a thing of the stimulus 6, like both directions in all three planes of motion relevant to our target movement. So we did this in our deadlift accessory download, available at lungeandlift.com, where we did the 3D deadlift matrix. And all we're doing there is moving in both directions, in the sagittal plane, in the frontal plane, and the transverse plane, relevant to a deadlift. So we're reaching forwards and back, left and right, and rotating left and right. Super simple, but we are grooving the same movement pattern that we're about to train in greater ranges of motion in all directions before we train it. The benefits are we get better muscle activation, because some muscles prefer lengthening in other planes of motion. They wouldn't get as much stimulation in a conventional. If you just did conventional deadlift in your warm-up sets, they wouldn't get as much lengthening and shortening as they will do when we move in 3 dimensions. We also get more of a stability stimulus because we're going further away from center and the normal balance point than we would do if we're just doing conventional deadlift. We also get specific mobility training because we're mobilizing the joints and the muscles involved in the movement, again, into bigger ranges of motion than we would do just doing conventional deadlifts, and priming our proprioception. So we're getting all those tissues and structures the experience of being in a bigger space than they would do just sticking with the conventional deadlift. And the benefit for that, in a warm-up is that we've essentially created a bit of a safety buffer around the normal bar path for bad reps. So in that, when you start to get tired and you maybe lose the bar a little bit far forwards compared to where you would want it, you've already been there in the warm-up. So one, your tissues have experienced that position. They're not going to freak out, and it reduces your chances of having a back spasm. But two, you've also developed strength in that position, and you're going to be more able to bring the bar back in line compared to, imagine you just did perfect deadlifts only in your warm-up. As soon as you come off path, your body's going to freak out because it doesn't have strength there, and it hasn't been there for weeks, months, or years if you've never done this sort of movement prep. So I think it's almost like a no-brainer that this is definitely a great thing from all those points of view. I can't really think of it. Even an elite powerlifter who is about to compete, I still think this would be a good thing for them to do in the warm-up. And then obviously getting much closer to the specificity of their competition lift before they go on stage. But for me, we talk about this a lot, that 3D deadlift, most people would benefit from having a heavy 3D deadlift more so than a heavy conventional deadlift, because in life, as Rob said earlier, you're picking up your kids and you're picking up heavy objects from awkward positions, from side bending and rotation. So training that 3D deadlift as a real movement to progress in its own right, I think is something that I want to normalize that is a training goal for its own purpose.
I think a really nice way to kind of think of this 3D movement prep is sticking with this deadlift example, that if I just do conventional deadlifts to warm up, right? This is not exact, but I'm going to be warming up the middle portion of my glute, just the middle. So if you put my glute into 3 parts, inside, middle, and outside, I'm just warming up that middle glute, right? Because that's all I'm doing. I'm going up and down, up and down. To go sideways, I then need to do some form of hip shift into the side, which is again with the 3D dumbbell deadlifts. And I need to also add some rotation to really get into that inside part of the glute. So if I've got a fully warmed up glute, it's going to be more powerful, it's going to be more switched on, which then in turn will mean I'll lift more weight. And as Ash said there, it's that thing of, if you're exposed to something, your body is not scared of it, because don't get me wrong, the loading might be way more than it's comfortable with, but then it understands what to fire to hopefully hold on to it, rather than going, what the fuck is this? And I've got to try and hold on to something. What am I going to use? Whereas if you've already done it, especially when you download our free download at lungeandlift.com, the deadlift accessories you're not doing, in there with the 3D deadlifts, you really are getting your body into some really interesting positions. And if you put, instead of those dumbbells, you put a child in your hands, not saying to do this with a child necessarily, but you could do, but that's it. Or you're putting in, say you're moving some boxes in your house, and if you pictured that while you're watching the demo video, you're like, you can see this applying to real life. And this is the thing, when you then take it into the training side of it, you're like, okay, I get that. The bar travels away from me and I can put it back in, or it's traveling out. Do you know, all these sort of things? It's exposing yourself, just like, doing like Jeffersons. So Jeffersons, where you're essentially completely rounding the lower back. Imagine the worst deadlift possible that you'd imagine. Essentially doing that and training that position, because there's nothing wrong with spinal flexion. So in going into that extreme, don't get me wrong, it probably isn't the most optimal. But, if you're training this position and you're getting strong in that position, that means when you lose the deadlift from your, say, brace state and you go into this other position, you're stronger there because you've been exposed to it. And that all, as we say, it comes from the warm-ups. And then I guess that then obviously now goes also into your accessory work, because that's when accessories then become a lot more specific to the intended stimulus.
Exactly. Yeah. So that would be number 2 on how to build in 3D training into your training, would be with targeted accessory work. So if we've identified we have an imbalance or a weak muscle or motion, we can target those with more precision. Kind of as we talked to in that squat example earlier, we've identified that we need more left hip adduction. So we can target that joint motion in our accessories with, an exercise. Say you're doing a left foot forward lunge with a left hip, left shift.
So just before you go, would you? So just
Yeah.
this is just me thinking about stuff I've learned so far. So with that shit, would that come potentially from then a turned in left foot to get more into that position?
Left toe in would get more left hip internal rotation, which would generally pair with left hip adduction.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
you'd get more left glute from
Yes.
that.
I'm learning. I'm learning,
Yeah.
guys.
Yeah. But yeah, so the point here is that rather than just doing generic single leg exercises to do your accessories, we can be more precise with our training stimulus. So we know what is most likely to support our main lift. So we want to get a stronger squat. So we want to work on those weak links, which are holding back our squats. They are our limiters. And we've identified that getting into the left hip is a fruitful area that we should put more effort into so we can go directly after it with extreme precision. And this helps us improve our mobility, but also our muscle activation. So like Rob was saying there, we're actually getting, in that example, the left glutes to do more because they are stimulated by left hip adduction and internal rotation. Like we were saying with the chest example earlier, we're talking to those muscles in their preferred language, which is specific planes of motion and joint motions that mean we can, get them lengthening and shortening, which is what muscles like to do.
So yeah, and at the end of the day, you're most likely, well, you should be, you're going to be doing accessory work anyway. So instead of just doing say, if you are doing any lateral lunges, instead of just doing a lateral lunge, maybe make it a bit more tailored toward exactly what you need. So those 8 reps are actually doing what you want and to make your main things better. Because at the end of the day, we're doing accessories to improve our main lifts most of the time. So if we're doing them to improve our main lifts, let's look at what's weak in our main lift and then make that lateral lunge specific. So it's not just, I'm ticking a box of doing a lateral lunge, because it's not just a game of ticking the boxes. That's the thing with training. It's the thing of getting better. So I guess a way to kind of combine this all is, because I think one of the main issues that I think a lot of people have when they see this, and I know I've had the same thought, is in like, when you start out doing maybe some of that movements that say Ash recommends or anything like this, you're like, this takes forever. Like I've got to do 3 sets of like this thing. I'm sweating. I've done nothing except for move my body. Like this is ridiculous. It's like, it's not, and you're like, it's taken so, yeah. No, but that's the thing. You think it's just like, I'm literally just doing some lateral, not lateral, but I'm just doing lateral lunges. Like, why is this so hard? And it's because they're specific to where you're weak, where you're unstable or whatever, or you don't have the necessary mobility. So something which I know that has really helped in the past is then combining those exercises into the session. So rather than doing all my movement prep at the start, I then say might do 1 or 2 of the pieces, and then say do my squats in the warm-up sets, some squats supersetted with maybe a squat specific movement prep for that hip. So then basically, instead of then keeping it separate, you then superset it and bring it together. So it then feels, not only does it make your squat feel better, because then that's my left hip is working more. It's like, okay, I'm switched on, I'm ready to go. It's then starting to then overall improve your movement mechanics, which is then going to improve your top end strength.
Exactly. So if we think about warm-ups as movement mechanics before your main lifting and accessory work as movement mechanics after your main lifting, supersets are a way of doing it within and in between your main lifting. And the benefit of doing this, that you can think of this as a movement mechanics primer or a pre-fatigue or even a post-fatigue, doing it immediately before or after your set, is the neurological proximity. So that basically means the skill acquisition. It's like doing a weightlifting complex. You do a clean pull before you do a clean, so your body can connect the dots more easily. In the same way, we're doing a left hip adduction drill before we do a squat. So then the brain's thinking, oh wait, that's how I adduct my left hip. And then you do a squat straight away. It's like, oh shit, I can adduct my left hip while I'm squatting.
Yeah.
And like Rob says, it's a great way to save time, but also from a skill transference point of view, the carryover is much greater. Like if you did your movement mechanics on a Monday and you didn't squat till a Thursday, the carryover would be very limited because your nervous system hasn't retained that skill as much. Whereas if you did it immediately before your squat set, it has the best chance of being carried over. The thing you need to be aware of here is that as your mechanics change, you're not going to be as strong in your squats with the new mechanics yet. So because you've been squatting on your right hip for years without using your left hip in that way, the left hip tissues won't be as conditioned as the right hip tissues are. So if you start doing your 90% squats for the first time into that left hip, there is a greater level of risk and there's a chance that the left hip will complain. So just beware that if you are doing that supersetting, you want to proceed with a little bit of caution to give those tissues a chance to catch up. But when they do catch up, your overall squat is going to be way stronger because you're getting more from that weak side.
Yeah, just like I kind of mentioned at the start where I said how, like, on my main squat day, I'm squatting. Like that's how I'm squatting. However, when I compete or anything like that, this is how I warm up. So I have consistency in that. That is a routine. That is a habit. That is how I train on my squat day. But then on my secondary squat days, so I might do some warm ups like that in that day. But then in my secondary squat days, where I'm going to focus a bit more on that left leg drive, in that maybe some accessories thrown in as well, some supersets. That's an ideal time because the loading isn't going to be as heavy. So I'm still getting that exposure, and then I'm also I'm hopefully not putting my body under too much stress where it can't then just grow. Because that's the thing, we're trying to find a new movement pattern that's hopefully more optimal to lift the weight. And obviously, the more neutral you are to the center, the stronger you're going to be. The further away from the center you go, the weaker you're going to be. So even if you have got these, you see some elite lifters doing some interesting lifts, and this is because they've got strong at that. That is their movement mechanics, and they've chosen not to try and keep themselves toward the middle, say. Now, just imagine if they had, imagine how much stronger they might have been. Who knows? Yeah. Because they haven't spent the time. They've gone so far down that rabbit hole. It's now counterintuitive for them because it's going to take them so long to say undo that movement mechanics and build back. That's a lot of the time. Training careers are not that long. So the amount of time it's going to take, they have to weigh up. Is it worth it? And it might be for some. Some people say, do you know what? I feel like I'm getting closer to injuries, or these niggles keep coming up and I do need to take a step back. And and we had that episode when does niggles become an injury? And I think it's this thing, we all have these little like niggles coming from day to day. You're like, is it really something I should be pushing through? And a lot of time we do. And sometimes it's fine. But a niggle is just a little indicator that something might not be working.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make the listeners aware of around the compensations in competition. Your compensation patterns today are the most efficient way for you to lift the maximal weight, but over time that can have negative consequences. So if you're going into competition, it's not the time to be changing your movement mechanics and using that weaker leg. However, the consequences arise with reps, with loads over time. So the emphasis of movement mechanics, if you are competing in a sport, you want to look at your season plan and think about the off season as when you do have like a heavy movement mechanics phase to lay those foundations of better movement patterns and more symmetrical loading, so that when you do peak, your compensations will come back to a certain extent, but you've brought up those weak links at the right point in time. Whereas if you're about to step on stage, you don't want that to be the first time your weak side gets under a 1 rep max.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest personal experiences that I can say to this, like when you do dive into more like 3D training and stuff, is you have to remove the ego, because you have to realize you are going to take some steps back, and it is going to feel frustrating. And it's just like when you come back from any injury, it's frustrating because you know where you've been and you know what you're capable of, and you're building that back. And like, for instance, my squat has been getting better recently because I'm still doing a lot of my movement mechanics stuff, and because of how that I have such glaring imbalances myself, and I've seen these, and from when you assess me and stuff like that, I now make sure I often do these things, especially prior to me squatting, because it helps me. and it's definitely been helping me. My squat is now just 2.5 kilos under my lifetime max, and it's feeling good. And it's also, I'm feeling when I did that the other day, I didn't feel like I broke down. It was just that was where my strength was, and I didn't feel like I was shifting too much to one side. Obviously I did have the Instagram angle, so I couldn't tell, but I felt stronger. I didn't feel all through my right leg, and this is the thing is this. I've started to. It's only just started to really come back around, and it takes time. These sort of things, and I think like as you always say, it's that. We want to stay as close to the specific thing we're trying to improve, but sometimes we do have to come a little bit further away because that's how much regression we need to really get into that imbalance.
Exactly. Yeah, you can't address an imbalance if you're working at maximal percentages. It needs to be light enough or slow enough that the body gets an opportunity to learn. As soon as you get into that fight or flight mode, that you're trying super hard, then the body's going to default to what it knows best, because that's what it feels safest doing, and it is safest doing it at those loads. So yeah, this is something we always say on the spectrum of specificity. We only go back as far as we need to get the training stimulus. So when we're looking to correct movement mechanics, we'll go as light as we need to get the joint movement that we want. That could be one step down. So it could be, sub 140 kilos for Rob in a back squat means he can get that left leg mechanic working. But for somebody else who's got a more severe imbalance, then it might just be a left leg lunge, and only at left leg lunge will that left hip start doing what we want it to do. But making that call is, the art of programming.
I think this then where it comes into these sort of movements can be main exercises, because I think that's like you've taught me over the times as well, is they're not just warm-ups. And this is a thing I remember you saying, like, that it's training, because it really is like when you're doing these things that are specific to your requirement, like, you feel fucked. As I said, like, I'm sweating. I'm like 20 minutes into a session, I'm like, I've not lifted a weight, or I've lifted 5 kilos. It's like, this is ridiculous, but it's targeting me in such a way that I'm just like, this is what I need. And I think just like with everything, tracking this and making sure that you're keeping note of what you're lifting, like that 5 kilos, say, using the deadlift as example, using the 5 kilo triplanar deadlift, I might then go up to the 10 kilos, then up to the, like, you doing that and you feel like, I remember when we did it, because if you download our free download, it's not just the movement happening, there's coaching behind it. And one of the coaching points we said is, well, one of the coaching common mistakes is going too heavy with the exercise. So I actually did it with two 22.5 kilo dumbbells in the demo. And yes, I could do it, but you could see I wasn't getting the correct stimulus, because as soon as I went above, say 10 kilos, I was then just going into brute strength, which is what my training is most of the time. Whereas then when you take it back into, say, the 10 kilos, and then I could progress to, say, 12.5 kilos. And then, you can progress on these little bits. And I think that's something that you kind of taught me, it's not just a warm up.
Exactly. I think that's something I want to make more prevalent as a training strategy, that these 3D movements are worthy of pursuit in their own right, as I said earlier. And depending on your goals, like what are you training for, it might make more sense to progress these as your section A in training, more so than the traditional squat, hinge, push, pull, because it has more carryover to your actual goal. So if you are just looking for general physical preparedness, like I said earlier, 3D Deadlift Matrix is going to benefit you much more than a 200 kilo deadlift. And equally, if you are a sports, like you play field sports or you play tennis or squash or something like that, where you are moving in all directions, you'd be far better off progressing your ability to move in 3 directions than just getting a heavier squat, which is a static piece of strength that just gets you going up and down on the same spot. You want to move through space. So progressing your ability to move through space, and like Rob said, tracking it and progressively overloading it is much more relevant to the outcomes that you want. And just because it's not the classic big 4 barbell movements, it doesn't mean you can't treat it like that and prioritize it like that. And it's something that I've been doing my own training for a little while now, where I will do rotational lunge patterns, which are more relevant to squash or the golf swing. And I can feel the benefits already. So I think we talked about this before. Back in lockdown, before like we were playing in the seven-side football league, me and my mate Pete would go out and have a kick around, do some football-specific drills. And I don't play very much football. I haven't played much football through my life. But just doing that, like a few sessions of football-specific movements, we then entered the seven-side league, which is very intense. And every time in my life that I've restarted playing football, been so sore, so beat up, didn't feel great playing the first game. And both of us felt absolutely fine, played really well, felt really nimble. And the other guys who hadn't been doing that pre-season had the normal soreness, the normal tight, like little niggles and stuff like that. And it's just a perfect example of more closely matching your training to what you want to use your body for has much more carryover. And because life is three-dimensional, 3D training will benefit most people much more than over obsessing on the static strength side of things.
Yeah, don't get me wrong, static strength stuff is great and it looks good. And that's thing, we're definitely not saying otherwise. And I'm definitely not saying otherwise. But I think it's when you're not afraid to look different in the gym, because that's also another part of it. Because this is, Ash puts a silly name on it, calling it silly lunges, because it's funny, right? Because it does look silly a lot of the time, but they're so specific that it's far from silly. It's just because you look different in the gym. And as I said, like, I know when you're at WIT that you see when people are doing their specific movement prep stuff, and they might look stupid, but they don't care because they know that's going to get them better at their main session, whatever that is, because they're priming their body how they need to. And this is, I think, CrossFitters, I think, are definitely more open to it because I think they already look silly doing a lot of the stuff that they do. And that's the thing. CrossFit, for me, made me just open my eyes to all training because I was then doing things that in a normal commercial gym you don't do. And because I had to not care what others thought, it just made me then appreciate everything. Because like doing butterfly pull-ups, you're like, what is this guy? And you know, whenever you talk to someone that doesn't know CrossFit, it's always, they do a silly pull-up things. It's like, when you break it down to someone, they're like, okay, it kind of makes sense, but still it's not good for you. I was like, all right, do you know what? It's just not worth going down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, doing wall walks and burpees over the rower in Fitness First.
Just doing a wall walk in its own. Good.
Yeah. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode, guys. I think just to wrap it all up, hopefully the takeaways you've come away with are like a better understanding of what triplanar training actually is and why it's a good idea. The fact that life is three-dimensional, so we should train more three-dimensionally as well. And hopefully I've hammered home the point that bones, joints, and muscles all operate in three planes of motion. So we can't fully stimulate them unless we expose the body to all three planes of motion. One thing that maybe we didn't talk about as much as I would have liked is that overusing certain planes can lead to loss of function in the others. So if we become very sagittal dominant, we actually can lose our ability to tap into the frontal and transverse planes. So it's something to consider in your overall programming. And I think the last point, as we were talking about building it into your training, is that adding in some work on all three planes of motion is actually bulletproofing your body against most sports and life. And that's from a mechanical and physiological point of view. Like mechanically, we are reducing the likelihood of compensations and imbalances, and physiologically, we're building tissue tolerance to deal with stress in those positions as well.
Beautifully put, mate. And for me, as a great way to kick off the next 100 episodes that we plan on going on to. So as always, thank you for listening. We really hope you enjoyed today, and definitely share with anyone you think might enjoy it, and also that you think maybe is only going up and down and needs to move side to side and maybe move those hips a bit more like John Travolta. So, but as always, don't forget to tag us on Instagram at lunge.lift, if you did share it, and just share any of our old episodes, and also head over to YouTube, give us a cheeky subscribe, like, share, and all that good stuff. And the reviews on Apple Podcasts are amazing. Please keep giving them. Really appreciate it. And thank you for everyone that's given us those 5 stars on Spotify. That's, I think that might be what's getting us into these random places like Kazakhstan and China and stuff like that. So thank you for these reviews. We really, really do appreciate that. So as always, thank you for your time. We really look forward to speaking to you next week.
Thanks, guys.